Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much once again for joining me at this slightly later time of 10 o'clock if you're in the UK. I really appreciate it. I know it doesn't suit everybody, but if that's you, the good news is that I have just finished, or Wheeler Dealers has just finished playing out the entirety of its series here in the UK, which means that if you want, we can go back to the old time of 9 p.m. I know it suits a lot of you. It actually suits me better. So now that the show's finished going out at 9 p.m, if you want, from next week, we'll go back to 9 o'clock starting. I know for many of you, it makes a bit of a difference wherever you are in the world, but let me know. As long as nobody has any major objections, we'll go back to as it was. Anyway, thanks so much for joining. Thanks if you did watch here in the UK on Discovery Channel the final episode of this current season of Wheeler Dealers. It's been amazing to be part of this whole process. I've loved every single second of it. Genuinely, I'm really, and still loving it because we're still making more and more. We're into filming the next series of Dream Car right now. And then it'll be more Wheeler Dealers after that. So there's loads more coming your way. But the positivity that's come from all of you guys and everybody online has been amazing. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We're here to talk about Formula One in the most part. I will obviously answer any questions you have, whether it's Wheeler Dealers based or anything else, so fire them in. But let's talk Formula One. I thought it was one of those weekends where the result was amazing, the storylines were amazing, the championship fight has taken another twist and turn. Even the weekend took different twists and turns as we went through it. Even during the course of the Grand Prix event, the weekend, the performance was ebbing and flowing from one side of this championship battle to the other. But when it really mattered, when the checkered flag came down, of course, it was Max Verstappen, miles out in front, miles faster. Importantly, it wasn't just a case of maximising a good result. It was clearly a faster car in those conditions around that circuit that led to him winning by something like 16 seconds in the end. So that was a dominant performance by Red Bull on Sunday. But on Saturday, of course, it swung completely the opposite direction against the form book, against what most people, even Mercedes, I think, expected. And that shows just how close this title can be and probably will be. And how the performance difference between the two cars and drivers is on a knife edge. And it just came down on Saturday to getting the tyres either in the right window or just not quite in the right window, which Red Bull didn't manage it. They couldn't get enough temperature over that outlap to get the performance from those tyres. And you saw what a difference it made to the performance of the car. Mercedes, on the flip side, did manage to switch their tyres on, something they'd struggled with at other parts of the course of Friday and Saturday morning practice. And yet, when it mattered on Saturday, they did the job. So this championship is not over by any means. Nobody should be writing this championship off now. Nobody should be celebrating a Max Verstappen win or commiserating a Lewis Hamilton loss. There is still 4 races to go and literally anything can happen. But I want to jump into your questions, as we always do, to lead this show. And I want to go back to one that came in really early on. So apologies that I missed it early on. I tried to catch it. So there were 2. Where is it? Okay, so Ruben H, thank you very much for joining early and firing a question in. He says, first of all, he says, thanks for all the efforts on Wheeler Dealers, really enjoying it. I appreciate that, thank you. He also says, I wondered how big is the travelling F1 world? Does everyone know each other? And is it easy to stay in touch with people and the ins and outs once you leave to pursue things like you have on YouTube and Wheeler Dealers? And that's a really good question, so I thought we'll start with that before we get into the weekend. The travelling circus of Formula One is enormous, and of course, particularly in a year like this where there are a lot of races, there's a lot of travelling, a lot of back-to-back events as well. It's a circus or a family, and it really is a family, where everybody moves around the world, typically together. And so you can't help but share dinners, share aeroplanes, share hotels with each other, find yourself in the same bar as guys from another team. So away from the racetrack, there's a huge community family feel, and everybody typically gets on really, really well. Obviously, when you go into the heat of battle, you know, at the racetrack during the day, you pull your own garage doors down and you keep yourselves to yourselves and you kind of focus on the job. But the moment you leave that circuit, everybody opens up and everybody is generally good friends. When you leave Formula One, what I found, and I know many of my friends have found the same, is when you do leave the sport, particularly after a long time and your whole life has been in that world, yes, it can be a bit of a transition because, like you probably hear in many stories of sportsmen or women who've been so dedicated and focused to their their world, their craft or their sport, you don't have much room left for the outside world. You don't have a huge amount of spare capacity to enjoy what most people might call normal life, going to families' barbecues and friends' parties and these things. You just don't have the time to do that because you're never in the country enough. So when you do leave and end up back in the real world, there's a definite transition to happen. So not always easy, but thanks for the question, Ruben. Let's bring it back to this weekend, because that's what we all want to talk about, the Mexican Grand Prix, or the Mexico City Grand Prix as it's now known. Let's talk about that, and where do we want to start? Because we went into the weekend, obviously, as most people did, thinking, right, this is going to be a Red Bull dominated weekend. They're typically always been quicker. Mercedes have always struggled a little bit more. We've talked about it on the previous show, where they struggle at the altitude, particularly around the power unit side, with the turbo having to work extra hard to generate the performance that they might otherwise get at other racetracks, and that might be a weaker area historically for them. Also, the fact that the air's thin and it's difficult to generate the amount of downforce that you want, even with maximum wing levels on, means that the cars that inherently have the most downforce, and clearly that is the Red Bull in the current situation, well then they have the best ability to produce more downforce. When you're struggling for everything you can, the Red Bull's going to produce a bit more than the Mercedes is, and around this particular circuit that generally works for you. Of course, on the long straight you don't want the downforce, you want the top speed, and that was Mercedes' strength around this weekend, but it wasn't enough to overpower the entire circuit and generate the best lap times, other than when it came to Saturday. And then, as I said, it was all about switching on tyres. So performance is balanced on a knife edge, which is why we've enjoyed this season so much. What did you all think? Let's see. Hamilton will now have to win every remaining race to retain his title, barring either car unreliability or major driver error by Verstappen. Therefore, it's Max's title to lose. Well, it clearly is Verstappen's title to lose, given that he's in front. And you could say that whoever was leading, couldn't you? Because they're in the front, they've got track position in the title race, and it's them who can only throw it away. Because if they win everything, it's in their hands. If they win everything, it's Max's to take right to the end. Lewis, of course, has to overturn that. So he has to, as you say, outscore Verstappen by enough points, enough of a lead in every single race to overturn that, 19-point lead as it is now. Substantial, but not enough to start calling a championship winner yet, I would suggest. If Max wins in Brazil, all he has to do is finish second at every race after that, says Alfie Willis. Alfie Wills, sorry. Yes, I mean, there are a number of permutations where you could start to look at, as we all do every single year. It's hard not to, isn't it? But I think either driver, if you ask them right now, will simply be focusing on winning this championship. And of course, let's say Lewis can manage to drag out a race win in Brazil and bring that title battle just a little bit closer. It's really going to come down to the second drivers in each of these teams. And I know that many of you want to start talking about this, about Bottas particularly, and potentially about Perez as well. But the second drivers, we knew this right from the beginning of this championship, didn't we? But this is the crunch time. This is where the second drivers really have to step up and play their part, because not only can they score points for the team in the team's championship, which is now only separated by 1 point, but they can also take valuable points away from their teammate's title rival, and that could genuinely be the difference around the last 4 races that we've got. And if you look at the second drivers right now, it's Perez that's coming into form. I certainly wouldn't say Bottas has lost his form. I think he had a very disappointing Sunday, obviously sparked by something that wasn't his fault in the first corner when Ricciardo hit him. But I thought, delivered a stunning Saturday, pole position. But then even, as we see so often with Valtteri, when he gets tipped towards the back, he struggles to make headway. He doesn't seem to have the confidence to be able to make those bold moves that the likes of Verstappen or probably Hamilton, or even I would say Perez in the most part, is able to do. So he's got to step up. Perez has kind of hit form at the right moment for his team, where he's suddenly found a way of getting to grips with this car, and that could be something that really favours Red Bull as the season plays out. Did you see Checo's dad celebrating the podium as if it was the loveliest thing I've ever seen, says William Harris. I did, and I also saw the interview that he did on Sky with Simon, and it was just brilliant. It was brilliant. I thought we could have gone on for an extra half hour listening to Checo's dad. What a proud moment it is. I mean, makes you realise, it's a little bit like Ferrari in Italy, isn't it? It's a nation that's behind the red cars when we go to Italy. It's a nation that's behind this one driver, Checo, in Mexico. And, what an amazing moment for him and his entire family. So, yeah, a lovely moment to witness for Checo. You can see what it meant to him, but it perhaps even more impressively for his family, his father, the many supporters that he has around that place was just brilliant to watch. I loved every second of it. Wholesome TV content that was. Right, let's... I love these comments, by the way. I've got to call it out because these do make me laugh. Luis, I think that's how you pronounce it. Elvis, you sound like a Lewis fanboy. I don't like that. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because maybe you're new around here, but I'm sure anybody who's watched this channel for any length of time knows that I'm a fanboy of Lewis Hamilton. I'm equally as much of a fanboy for Max Verstappen. I have massive respect for both of them, and I'm loving witnessing this title play out. And I genuinely don't care which way it goes. Yes, I'm a Brit. Yes, I would love to see a Brit win, but I've seen that for 7 years on the trot now. And to see it being shaken up, to see Lewis being challenged with a driver of the calibre of Max Verstappen is just amazing. I feel privileged to be able to watch it. So I am definitely not a Lewis fanboy to the extent where I'm biased one over the other. I see the weaknesses in Lewis, I see his strengths, as I do in all of the drivers on the grid, and I try and remain as unbiased as I can whilst doing stuff like this. So I'm sorry that that's how you saw it. It's not how the reality is. Right. I'm a Kimi fanboy. Yeah, I'll openly admit I'm a Kimi fanboy. It says free to wheel. Okay. Right. So let's talk about Checo. So Checo did a great job. In fact, let's start with Bottas. Let's get that out of the way. I know many of you were joking around before we went on air about we might as well start firing them in, the potential alternate jobs that Valtteri Bottas could do. I saw somebody say, it might have been Josh Smith, he should be a doorman because he left the door wide open for Max Verstappen to come through. Look, Valtteri, when you look back at that first incident, that turn one incident, the braking zone into turn one, made the wrong decision, and they will analyse it as they always do. He will, along with his team, they'll look at that scenario and say, when they went into the first corner with Valtteri slightly in front of Lewis, Max well behind as they entered the braking zone, Valtteri took the decision to move over to the right-hand side, which would be the natural thing to do in a racing scenario. You tend to move to cover the inside line because that's where typically the threat's going to come from. But in this scenario, on the inside was Lewis, on the outside was Max. And what he did, of course, was move over and left the racing line open. If he'd moved left, if he'd chosen what might be the more unnatural decision to move to the left-hand side, cover where Max eventually ended up, of course, he had Lewis to his right. So Lewis could have equally moved over and would have done, because that's the natural way you want to enter a corner, as wide as possible. And they'd have closed off both those gaps and Max would have been left behind in no man's land and struggling to find a way past. But he chose the wrong decision. And yes, it's a split second. These things are happening at 200 miles an hour, split second decisions. With hindsight, he got that wrong. It's difficult to criticise too much because massive pressurised situation. He's probably trying to look in both mirrors at that moment, and he made the wrong call when we look back at it. Maybe he'll do differently if something like that happens again. It was what happened after that that was most disappointing from Valtteri when he got pushed towards the back. Obviously he's frustrated, but just didn't show that killer instinct that you might look for in that kind of scenario to start making his way back through the field in what was still one of the fastest cars on the grid. Difficult place to do it, I'll admit. It's a difficult circuit to overtake unless you've got a significant pace advantage, even with that long straight. But as I'm sure you heard the commentators talking about all weekend long, the sort of less dense air at that altitude means that DRS has a slightly less impact than normal. So you do need a significant pace advantage to get by, but he didn't manage to do it this weekend. So that was Valtteri. Have we got any job titles coming through for Valtteri? No, you've all eased up on him a little bit. So, yeah, well done to you. Well done. Valtteri has a job to do, as does Checo in the remaining 4 races. They both know what that job is. And yes, you know, they both have seats secure for next year. No one's necessarily fighting for their career at this point. They only need to do the job that the team needs them to do. And Checo kind of did that. You know, yes, it would have been great if he'd managed to get past Lewis from their perspective, but he did a very stellar job, got both cars onto the podium, and that was a decent result. So let's talk about Checo. And yes, Bottas had an awful pit stop as well. Thank you, Jan Lotvel. That didn't help his race. It was a terribly unlucky weekend for Valtteri. Yes, he didn't maximise his own potential, but he also had a huge amount of bad luck. It was kind of one to forget for him, wasn't it? The one thing he did do is take away the fastest lap point from Max Verstappen, of course, which could make the difference. The team are 1 point ahead of the Red Bull outfit at this point in time. It could end up being that close. And that 1 point that Max would have otherwise got for the fastest lap, well, that could make the difference. Who knows? Okay, let's talk about Checo quickly. So Checo, I thought, as I said, brilliant job. What Checo did really well, as he always does very well, is he managed to run very long, didn't he, in that first stint. He's very good at looking after tyres. We know that. And that gave him the opportunity, at least, to close up on Lewis towards the end of the race. And look, that spiced things up. That gave him an opportunity, gave him a shot. It was a fairly decent call from Red Bull. I'm not sure that there would have been another call that might have made a different outcome. There's a possibility that if he had literally mirrored Lewis's pit stop, that maybe he'd have had a better opportunity, but I just don't think so. They needed the tyre offset to have the pace advantage to at least even go for the overtake. I just think it just wasn't enough in the end. So first and third was a decent result. From Lewis's perspective, getting in between those two was probably as good as he could do, because the Red Bull genuinely was the fastest car on race day. And so probably you would say that in a Mercedes, third would have been your best outcome if you look at it on paper to start with, notwithstanding where they all started. So to get in between the Red Bulls is probably as good as Lewis could hope for. But I thought Checo did a decent job. Do pit stop crews relax more when the second driver pits? Absolutely not, says Dennis Y. No, of course not. No, the pit stop crews, it doesn't matter who comes into the box. You'll do the same job for everybody with the same intensity, with the same focus. I've never known anybody to treat one pit stop for one driver differently to any other. I'm sure you all know it's the same crew, so there's not different crews for each driver. It's the same crew, and you carry out the same process. And in fact, it would be very difficult to do anything different because you're so honed on what you do. It's drilled into you to muscle memory. You don't think about it. There's no time to think about it. It's just a reaction over a couple of seconds. So the pit stop focus and intensity is the same for whichever driver comes in, and don't let anyone tell you any different. Let me see. Interlagos is 1,400 metres lower. Do you think Merc's turbos will prosper? I think it's less about the turbo and the engine at Mercedes these days than it is about overall downforce production. And, one thing Brazil has is some very, very long, fast straights, even though some of them are not actually straight, but flat out sections of the racetrack where top speed is a big, big plus. Yes, of course, it has many twisty bits as well, and there is, thinner air than you might find at most other racetracks. Nowhere near as extreme as Mexico. I don't think that's going to be a big Achilles heel for them, but, it's about fine margins, and we know that Red Bull has better downforce production, so we're probably not running at absolute max downforce at Interlagos like we were this weekend at Mexico City. That would negate some of Red Bull's advantage in that sense, in that if you're at max downforce, so there's literally nothing more you can do to your car to create downforce, the car that inherently has the most, in this case the Red Bull, because of its higher rake philosophy that it has around its aerodynamics, well then that car has an advantage. When you move away from the maximum downforce, of course there's still questions around efficiency, but you can dial in more or less downforce because you have a little bit more scope on the range. That will be more the case at Interlagos, and therefore Mercedes can start to offset a little bit of the slightly more higher producing downforce car that Red Bull have, which worked in their favour this weekend. So I don't expect it to be a big problem for them, but as I said, we're talking about fine margins, and when the air is thinner, you might still look to Red Bull to have a tiny advantage around there. But it's a circuit that Lewis absolutely loves, so let's wait and see. Anything can happen. What's the reason that Perez wasn't able to pass Hamilton during the race? I think mostly that he didn't have enough of a pace advantage. It's one of those circuits that, although we have that long straight, as I said, it's less DRS affected because the air is thinner, and therefore the reduction in drag, because there's just less of it, is less effective. And also coming onto that long straight, you have to be close enough to be able to maximise it by the time you get to the end, and I don't think he had enough of a pace advantage to be able to do that. So they say you need about a second in hand over the car in front, a second a lap in hand, to be able to easily make in terms of outright lap time over and over, to be able to make a clean overtake. And I don't think Checo had that for most of the race. So I think that was why it's a sign of modern Formula One. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. Of course, it was a one-stop race. It was actually a fairly dull race after that first lap, wasn't it? And largely that's partly, at least partly because of the one-stop strategy, where everyone's just going to make one pit stop, more or less, around the same window of the race, not entirely, but they're going to make one pit stop and then they're going to go to the end. We know which tyres they're going to go from and to pretty much, because there's only one option. And so it takes away a bit of variation. So I'd love to know your thoughts on the idea, and we can keep these running in. I'll dip in and out of them as they come through. I'd love to know your thoughts on the idea of mandating 2 pit stops. Whether that is simply a rule that says, like we have now, you have to have 1 pit stop. You could change that to saying you have to have 2. Or whether it's through changing tyres to the point where there's no way a tyre can do a long stint like we saw yesterday, and therefore they would wear out, so you have to do 2 pit stops. Does mandating 2 pit stops to anybody feel too false? For me, not really, given that we already mandate 1. So if that's false, mandating 2 makes no difference. But we see over and over again, in my mind, the 2 pit stop races are almost always better than 1 stops, because it gives a bit of variation, a few more options in terms of strategy. But I'd love to know your thoughts on it as well. So Q2 tyre rule needs to be abolished, says the Undisputed. Well, I think you'll be pleased to know that I'm almost certain it is going to be. I'm pretty sure that from next year we won't have the Q2 tyre rule, meaning that you won't have to start the race on the tyre that you qualified in Q2 if you're in the top 10. It's being discussed right now, but I know that Ross Brawn already feels like there's no reason we can't get rid of that. So you might get away with that one. 2-stop mandatory will make it fun, and all those races are better. All those races are better. Yeah, I agree with you. I hate one-stoppers, and I hate F1 cars not being able to follow each other. Okay, I mean, lots of people feel similar about that, so yes. Marc Wilmot says, what about if they all have to use all 3 tyre compounds? I mean, that is obviously another way, another variation of mandating 2 pit stops, isn't it? Using all 3 tyre compounds during the race. Personally, I'm all for that. I think, why not? Why not use that as a way to give teams different options about when they want to use them? Yes, they might all use the same 3 tyres in the same sequence. Many of them might. But at least they have variation on using undercuts and overcuts, using strategy around pit stops, which, does mix up races, and it brings strategies converge towards the end of a race, where so often we see the closing laps where 2 opposing strategies start to close in on each other, and it might only be with 5 laps to go that those 2 strategies really play out on the same bit of racetrack again. We've seen it over and over again, and I'm with you. I love that kind of racing. So for me, that would be a decent rule to start thinking about. Maybe you have to use a really soft sprint tyre for 5 to 10 laps. Well, I think if you mandated using all 3 tyres, you probably wouldn't use the soft tyre or the softest tyre for many more than 10 laps in a race anyway. So that's kind of the effect you'd probably end up with. Let the teams decide. Let the teams decide what? If you mean let the teams decide how many pit stops they do, I mean, that's kind of what we have, isn't it? Other than the one that's mandated, and there aren't very many races where you could just do the entire race on the tyre you started the Grand Prix with. 3 tyre compounds is a waste and bad for the environment. Well, Robert, they actually destroy all the tyres that get mounted onto rims anyway, whether they get used or not. And you might say, why on earth do they do that? Well, at the start of a Grand Prix weekend, of course, the teams take all of their wheels, their rims, down to Pirelli, who will then mount all the tyres for their allocation for the weekend on. And that's a mixture, of course, of all 3 compounds plus the wets. Then what happens is at the end of the weekend, some of those, of course, never ever get used on a car. So you might get to a weekend where you only use one set of your hardest compound tyres and you don't ever use the others, or vice versa. At the end of a Grand Prix, if they've been mounted onto rims, they have to go back to Pirelli and be demounted, so taken off the rims again, and they can't be remounted again because the beads are no longer secure enough, they're no longer sure enough to put back onto a rim again and trust to run a race. So actually, Pirelli take all of those back and they destroy them. They don't just throw them away, they do get recycled, as all of the tyres do, used or otherwise. They get recycled and used for all sorts of things. They make cement, believe it or not, that goes into road surfaces out of little tiny beads of rubber that are burnt in a furnace, hardened and then mixed in as part of an aggregate. So there's and actually there are a number of other ways that ex-F1 tyres are recycled and reused. So they're not just wasted and thrown away, but it is a use of material that perhaps otherwise we wouldn't need if we didn't need so many tyres. So I kind of get your point, but it's not a complete waste. Right, 2 stops are entertaining because they can catch one-stoppers. Yes, agreed. I knew a guy at the pub who will buy all the used tyres from Pirelli. Excellent. We all know a guy down the pub like that, don't we? Actually, funnily, just today on Wheeler Dealers or a Dream Car, I've been making some clocks out of F1 brake discs. So that was really interesting. Watch this space, you'll find out where they end up before long. Right, so William Harris says, Elvis, watch Rush and Le Mans 66, 2 of the best motorsport movies of all time. Seen them both, love them both. I agree with you, Russ, that is absolutely fair. Right, sorry, William, that was. Thank you, William. I agree with you. Great movies. Right, so new concept. How about a tyre that lasts the whole race down to skill alone? Well, we've done that, haven't we? We've definitely done that. Yes, it's possible to do, of course, and it just needs somebody to decide that's what we do. If you do that, you do sacrifice a huge amount of performance because that tyre has to be durable enough to last the race. So you're going to make much slower cars. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They don't need to be the world's fastest cars to be interesting and entertaining in Formula One. It's just a decision that somebody needs to make. It does negate the idea of a pit stop unless you have a major incident. And I personally, and perhaps obviously, don't want to lose pit stops from Formula One because I think it's an amazing spectacle of human ingenuity, of human teamwork. It's one of the most amazing choreographed moments in sport, I think. And I think we should be proud of that and showing it off as an industry, as a sport. And secondly, it does mean that if you get a puncture or if you have some problem with a tyre, your race is over. Whereas at the moment, if you're lucky, you can have a problem with a tyre, you can have a flat spot or you can have a puncture. And if you've got to make pit stops anyway, well, maybe you can get away with making your pit stop and get back in the race and knowing that everyone else has to make a pit stop too. So for me, I kind of like the idea of pit stops. I don't want to lose them, but I get your point. I'd like to see tyres that drivers are able to push a little bit more on rather than having to manage pace. But if we mandated 2 pit stops, of course, there'd be less of that going on anyway, because the stints would be shorter. So less tyre management, more about extracting the maximum performance out of each tyre for the length of stint that they are capable of doing. Twisted Metal giving a shout out for the likes, and I agree with him. 130 likes, come on guys, we can do better than that. Smash that like button, I'd really, really appreciate it. It does make a difference, you know, how far the YouTube algorithm pushes this video up the order, how far it gets shared around, how many people get to see it, and that makes a difference to me. It really helps me. Apart from anything else, it helps motivate me to keep going because I'm doing these videos when I genuinely don't have time to do them. I do them not just for that, because I love doing them as well. I love chatting to you on a Monday night. So, but more likes would be really appreciated. So definitely fire them in there if you don't mind. Right, who decides on pit stops? Teams, FIA or tyre supplier? Well, it's a combination. So the rules, we're going into a brand new set of rules, of course, for next year. And that's been for the first time, really, it's been a proper group organised, discussion. The teams have been involved, the FIA have been involved, and Formula One themselves, of course, the promoters have been involved, the commercial rights holders, rather. And so that's how it should be, really, because they all have a different aspect. Now, they shouldn't all be just deciding rules and changing rules once the season gets underway, but it's right and fair that they all have an input into this, because they all have a different perspective. They all come at it from a different angle, and I think that's the best way to do it. It also might mean that some of the loopholes that you often find when it's just Formula One and the FIA deciding a set of regulations and presenting them to the teams in those scenarios that we've had over many, many years will often just look at them and go, okay, well, they obviously clearly haven't seen this loophole that's glaring at us, so we're going to design something that's going to slot into that loophole. Might go completely against the intention of the rules. It might make the cars either super fast, negate any pegging back of speed that was originally intended. There are it might increase cost massively, and these loopholes are the very first thing that teams see when they look at a new set of regs. So by having the teams involved this time around to a much greater extent, between them, they've all kind of self-policed it and flagged up the potential loopholes long before the regs get set in stone, so that when we get into next year, we're not suddenly uncovering something that might mean you've got to spend hundreds of millions of pounds that no one can afford in a budget-capped era to compete against someone that might have come up with a particular solution. It doesn't mean we won't get any ingenuity and any creativity, because we may well do. It just means we probably won't get the giant loopholes like a double diffuser type thing that we've had in the past. And I think that's the right way to go, personally. So to answer your question, it's a collaborative effort who decides on pit stops and rules. Extra pit stop is potentially unsafe, don't you think? For what reason? Anthony De Winter, why would it be unsafe? I'm not sure. Clarify that one and I'll come back to it. How much influence does Newey have on the Red Bull car? Still has a lot, and I know that for a fact, in that he doesn't design every component like he did back in the old days, but he definitely has a massive steering influence on the philosophy that they're going down. This high rate concept that they've pursued for so many years, with so many struggles around it, which only now really is finding its maximum performance, combined with the Honda power unit, of course, has been massively led by Adrian Newey. It's something he believed in, it's something that he pioneered, and wasn't good. He's a determined character. He was not going to let that idea go. So they've suffered for a number of years when they're trying to figure it out, until they get to the point where they can realise its potential, which is what they're doing now. So he's very much like that as a character. If he gets a good idea in his mind, he will not let it go. He will be persistent with it. He'll corral the rest of the team to follow him down a certain direction, and invariably he's correct. It doesn't always work first time, but because he's so determined, he'll find a way to eventually get the performance. So that's one of his strengths. Some people would say it can be a weakness at times, but I'd say that in the most part, he's been proven right time and time and time again through many different types of regulations. So I think he still has a very big influence on the car, and will do over the course of next year's car too. Ross Brawn working with F1 definitely helps with the rules. Absolutely, yeah. Together, it's not just Ross Brawn actually. It's a big collection of ex-F1 team members now. There is, of course, who else have we got? Smeders. Smeders is Rob Smedley working for F1 now, of course, as well. Who else have we got? There's a number of, the names have escaped me, but there are a number of them. A number of people that used to work at high level in teams that have now moved over to the FIA and are helping to shape the future of the sport, which I think can only be a good thing. How's the tree house? Where did that one just go? Oh, I've just lost it. Somebody asking about the tree. Oh, there you go. How's the tree house? I'm missing the stories from the tree house. Yeah, the treehouse is still there. It needs a bit of maintenance because I haven't been up there for a while. But yeah, I kind of went through, if you haven't seen the Tales from the Treehouse episodes on this channel, if you're new around here, can I encourage you to go and look at them, because they're little extracts from my book where I've expanded on some of the biggest and hopefully the best stories from my time in the sport and that were contained in the book. And I just kind of don't know why it was in a treehouse. I had a treehouse and the kids weren't using it, so I decided to go up there and start making videos. But I thought they were quite good videos, quite entertaining videos, and some nice behind the scenes stuff around some of the bigger stories that you might know, but maybe don't know some of the details that I'll share. So go and check them out. I'm a bit unsure about Nikita Mazepin. He seems such a lovely man off track, but I've heard his personality on track is atrocious, says William Harris. I don't know the guy, and like most of us, we are only judging him off track from the bits of social media and that controversy that flared up, you know, just after he was announced as an F1 driver, which was obviously awful, and it didn't put him in a good light at all. So I can't really comment on his character because I don't really know him enough. What I can say about his actions on track is that he struggled this year. Now that's not uncommon for a brand new driver coming into the sport in what is a very, very difficult car. But I think he struggled more than you might imagine a top level Formula One driver to do. He's up against Mick Schumacher, of course. Now, look, Mick's generally got the pace on him. He's generally beating him more often than not. But there are occasions when Nikita is kind of, you know, doing well and outshining Mick on the odd occasion. So he's not an absolute joke in a racing car. He's not someone who you would immediately say just should never be anywhere near an F1 track. I would not say, if I'm going to be honest, I would put him up in the top 20 drivers in the world. But that's nothing new to Formula One. I wouldn't say he's someone that's an embarrassment behind the wheel and deserves no place. So he's one of those that's kind of mucking around at the back in a car that must be incredibly difficult to drive. Could be better, but could also be a lot worse. How about that? Thanks for the tip, Mark. When you redo the plastering, don't forget to redo the damp-proof course to stop rising damp. Thank you very much. There's all sorts of information on these shows on a Monday night. I appreciate it. Thank you. Do you think it's possible that Hamilton or Verstappen might break mentally before the end of the season? Interesting question. That really is an interesting question. My gut feeling is no for either of them, because I think they're both seemingly pretty mentally stable characters, mentally strong characters. We know that Lewis has, you know, been in championship fights where he's won and lost, some of them very, very tough, some really tough to take, and I've witnessed some of that firsthand. I know that Lewis is not infallible, like anybody. Nobody's infallible, and I've seen Lewis have failures, mental failures and mental toughness, but he hasn't kind of managed to come through very easily. I don't know Max Verstappen in the same way, but certainly what I see, and certainly from the people that do know him that I speak to, they say he's one of the calmest, most level-headed characters when it comes to dealing with pressure, and I can believe that. So I don't think that either of those two will break in this kind of scenario. But it is an interesting topic that we've kind of touched on, haven't we, over the past shows. Mental capacity, mental ability, mental toughness, mental well-being in and around the Formula One world. Something that definitely doesn't get enough coverage, doesn't get enough attention, both inside the sport still, I would say, and outside. So interesting point that you bring up. I would say, you know, of all the drivers on the grid, those two are probably two of the strongest in that regard. They seem laser focused on the job in hand, and I think they'll be fine. Hopefully they'll be fine to the end of the season. Right. Would you ever build your own project car like Ant Ansted did? Yes, I definitely would do. It's something actually I keep thinking about, and I haven't got a garage here at home. I mean, I've barely got a house right now. We're in the middle of building that, so I can't do anything here at home. I definitely want to build a Caterham 7. I was out in one. It was the car that I started my motorsport career in, racing Caterham 7s. We did one recently on Dream Car, and I was out last week driving it around Wales, and the experience behind the wheel of a Caterham 7 if you've never had a go, if you've never been fortunate enough to get behind the wheel, I urge you to try and take one for a test drive if you can. They are the most amazing driving experience, and at some point I am definitely going to build one. So there's my project car. But look, like what Ant did with the Alpha was an amazing project, and yes, I'd love to do something bespoke like that. I'm actually meeting Ant, hanging out with Ant this weekend. We're both going to the NEC. Quick side note, if anyone is going to the NEC this weekend, it's the Classic Car Show, massive event across the NEC. I'll be there all weekend, right through from Thursday to Sunday. Ant's coming down as well, Mike's going to be there. In fact, all of your favourite car shows from Discovery and Quest, they're all going to be there. All the presenters are going to be there. I'm hosting the stage, the live stage, along with Mike. As I say, Ant's going to join me. So just come along and say hi. If you're in the vicinity, if you've got tickets, if you haven't got tickets, you can still get them. Come down. It's a great weekend, and I'd love to meet as many as possible. So yes, I'll be chatting to Ant about all sorts of stuff like that over the weekend. So come on, have a go, have a look if you can. Why are pit stops taking an extra half a second, says Jack Mundo. So this may have passed many people by. I don't think it got great coverage, if I'm honest, on the TV. There was a rule change a few races back, which was a rule change that was slipped in to increase safety around pit stops. And essentially what it does is to stop people automating too many of the processes around the pit stop operation. Some of the teams were using automation, so when the gun goes tight, the wheel nut goes tight, there's a torque sensor on the gun. When it sees the correct torque, as long as the button has been pressed already, it will then illuminate the light. So essentially it automates the light to say the wheel nut's tight, and that can then automate the jack process. When it sees two lights from both guns on the front, let's say, it can automate the jack and just drop it automatically, removing that human element. The regulation change has essentially been to introduce, to mandate in that process, in this whole traffic light system around the car, a time that they determine to be, you know, standard human reaction time. And I forget exactly what it is. I want to say like 0.2, but I can't remember. I might have got the timing wrong. But there's a mandated time period between the button being pressed and the jack seeing a signal, or sorry, seeing the jack being able to be dropped. And that's to stop the system just being automated to that level. Essentially what that means is the teams now have to press the button when the wheel nut is tight, rather than just having it pressed and let the light illuminate itself off the torque sensor. They need to do the nut up and then manually press that button, so that takes a fraction longer. And as I said, this imposed human reaction time adds up to around about a few tenths, maybe half a second on occasions. And it's just been a little bit of things that some teams have had to get used to. We've seen a few failures. Even Red Bull had a couple of mistakes when they're having to change a process after years of doing it one way. I don't think it's actually any safer. I think that's the thing that frustrates me a little bit. Half a second or a couple of tenths or whatever it is, there is no time to stop and think and check if that wheel nut is tight in 0.2 of a second. There's no way anyone can do that. You're still going off instinct. And so if the wheel nut was loose, you're still going to press the button because your instinct does it. And then after you've pressed the button, which illuminates the light to tell the jack man the wheel nut's tight, if you then notice the nut's not on for some reason, well, you've already told the jack man that the wheel nut's tight and he's probably already dropped the jack. So I'm not sure it's much safer. It's one of these things they've introduced to try and just add an extra layer of safety. And as you've seen, it tends to be adding around about 3 or 4 tenths, maybe half a second for some teams in the overall pit stop times. That's the reason. I hope that explains it. Has Lewis lost the World Championship this year? Well, not yet, as I said. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. I mean, clearly, just on a pure numbers game, Max has a significant advantage with 4 races to go, and therefore he's got to be the favourite. But, we've got 2 racetracks coming up that no one's been to. Who knows who they will favour? We don't know yet. They'll have all done their simulations, but that's only simulation. No one's going to really know what the track surface is like at a macro level, what the temperature is going to be like on the day, how these tracks are going to affect tyres and who it might favour. So those are literally unknowns. You can look at the layout and say, okay, well, It might have really long, fast straights and be lower downforce. That might suit the Mercedes, but who knows? Until we get there, we genuinely won't know. So I think that's an open one. 2 races there that could be anybody's. Brazil, yes, Red Bull and Max Verstappen, on paper at least, have an advantage, but that doesn't mean it's going to be anywhere near as big as it was in Mexico. And it also doesn't mean that literally anything can happen. We've seen both of these drivers not finish races at other occasions this season. Formula One is one of those sports where literally anything can happen over the course of lights going out and flag dropping. And any one of those little incidents could massively swing or shape the championship. So there's no way that we can stop watching. There's no way you can assume anything's done. Max is in the advantageous position. If he continues winning races, he will win the championship, and Lewis has to fight. But Lewis is a fighter. He's done it before. He's overturned deficits in the past at different points in a championship, and there's nothing to say he can't do it again. The team are brilliant. A strategy decision the wrong way or not could make the difference. A puncture, an engine failure, a collision. Literally anything could happen. So it's too early to say that either driver has won or lost the championship yet. And that's not me sitting on the fence, that's just fact. Do you think Lewis still needs an engine change? No, I don't think so. I think they are hopefully now all sorted when it comes to that kind of thing. So yes, I think under normal circumstances he'll now see out the rest of the season, I would hope. I definitely don't want an engine penalty to come into play and affect the championship. There we go, look, Romeo Moldovan has put some numbers on it. 62% Max, 38% Lewis's chances. I've no idea if they're accurate, but thank you very much. They sound great and about accurate to me. Right. Yes, sprint event. This is a sprint race. Floyd Visser. Sprint race, of course, this weekend, which is another variable in the mix. And it also means we've got 3 points, of course, up for grabs on a Saturday with the sprint or the sprint race. I hate the fact that no one wants to call it a sprint race. It is a race. It may only be a shorter one, but it's still a race. That means anything can happen. That means there'll be wheel-to-wheel action, cars fighting for the same bit of racetrack. And yeah, look, last time out it didn't really work, did it? It wasn't the most spectacular event. They are looking at it, whether it can be tweaked for next year, whether we need to do more or less of them. I do think that format is going to stay at certain rounds next year, but it may be that the format is going to be tweaked a little bit, or the event is going to be tweaked, which is the right thing to do. That's what this was, as an experiment. We take the data and the feedback from that, and we apply changes or improvements, hopefully, and make it better next time. But this will be the third and final one for this season where we start to gain more information back. And you know, your feedback is as valuable as anyone else's, because this sport is about the fans, it's about entertaining people. So if we don't like them, we should say so. If we enjoy bits of it or we think we can improve it a certain way, absolutely make your feelings known. Formula One are definitely monitoring and watching social media, comments under their own videos on YouTube. You know, you may think that's a flippant comment that goes nowhere. They do read the comments, believe me. They use that as valuable feedback. I know that for a fact. So make your voices heard, whether you've got a strong feeling on it or not. But I would suggest waiting till this weekend is done, get that third and final bit of information before we make a hard and firm decision or feedback on what we've seen over the course of this year. It was an experiment, and I'm glad they've done it. I can't wait to see what happens this weekend, and then we can make a judgment on where we think we should go beyond that. But I think, look, it could provide opportunities. It does provide opportunities. We get the qualifying in the traditional sense on a Friday. We'll then go into Saturday, of course, and have this, what has got to be an opportunity, not only for the 3 points, which could be massive, of course, over the course of the championship, but also, as I said, wheel-to-wheel racing, drivers fighting for the same bit of tarmac, particularly around the start of the race. It's a chaotic first couple of corners, particularly, coming down in Brazil at the end of the straight, down that downhill left-hander into the centre S's. That's chaos at the start of a race, and we're going to get it twice this weekend. So even if only for that, surely that's something exciting to look forward to and could literally change the championship depending on how the outcome goes. Shark Max reverse grid for sprints. I think many of you know I'm not against that. I'm really not against that. I was looking at that. Have you seen the F1 visualised It's a Twitter account or an Instagram account. I think they're using it on the race website, the-race. Have a look at it if you get a chance, because it's really useful actually to see the race play out in kind of really simple formats, visualizing where the cars were between start and the end of a race in a kind of linear format. The one from yesterday kind of shows how boring the race kind of was, because the fastest cars, of course, just gradually start to pull away as the race goes on, gradually, very, very gradually extending their lead. Slower cars, of course, fall towards the back. And obviously that's what's going to happen in most race scenarios, is that if you put the fastest car at the front and the slowest car at the back, over the course of a long race, that gap is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. The fundamentals of how we go racing are flawed in that regard if you look at it as an entertainment perspective. So reverse grids, for me, I think would be another really interesting and valuable experiment. Not everywhere, let's just try it like we've done with sprint weekends. There's my thoughts. I'd love to see somebody give it a go. Right. What's your tipple tonight? Says Nutcracker. Peroni. Cheers. Right. How about having another tyre stop for the leading cars to level the field? I don't like that, because stuff like that means that there's a disadvantage to getting to the front in a race, and therefore you'd start strategizing around staying out of the top 10 until the last third of the race or something. I don't like that one, I'm afraid. I like the fact you've come up with a different idea. For me, it's not the right way to go. Reverse grids might work with next year's cars, says Nick Hardy. Yeah, it's always been one of the drawbacks, is the fact that you could easily get stuck at the back, even in a faster car, and not be able to overtake. Whereas, of course, the regulations for next year are all designed to try and make overtaking a little bit easier, which would, as you rightly say, lend itself perhaps more towards a reverse grid experiment. I'd rather have 2 qualifying and 2 sprint races on odd weekends. 2 qualifying and 2 sprint races on odd. John Norris. I'd rather have 2 qualifying and 2 sprint races on odd weekends. Sorry, mate, I'm not sure I get what you're saying there. Clarify it if you can in the next 5 minutes, and I will pick up on it. Right, unpopular opinion. Everyone who finishes a race should get points, says another user. Well, not that unpopular an opinion. I did a video on exactly that, another one you can go and check out, where I talked about doing exactly that, giving points all the way down to the last place, giving points for qualifying, and then reversing the grid. So in that little scenario, you'd have everyone having to go flat out in qualifying. You'd still see cars at their absolute limit, like we get today in qualifying, where it's literally the fastest guy around 1 lap. You get points for that as an incentive to just give it everything, and then you reverse the grid for Sunday, where of course there are more points on offer. But it will give teams down the back something to fight for. It will give you points on both days to fight for. Yes, of course it's complicated when it changes the history books and everything else about records and all that. I get it. I also get that some people say you shouldn't get rewarded for coming last, but if there's only 1 point where the winner's getting 20 or whatever you decide the split is, it's not much of a reward, is it? It may be something, but in the context of everyone getting points, it's really not very much. And yes, you'd have to change the prize money structure around it. I know it's complicated, but as a theory, I don't see why it shouldn't work, or couldn't be tried at least. Right. Yeah, Josh Smith said, Mark can't stop plugging the old YouTube videos tonight. Absolutely right. Go check them all out. Why not? Right, you're here anyway. You're on the channel. Just start flicking through the back catalogue. Right, what we got? 5 minutes to go. Reverse grid goes against a racing heart. It's pure for the show. Right, I get it, right? Reverse grid goes against a sort of pure racing heart. The only reason it does that is because at some point back in, the early 1900s, 1950 when F1 started, but before that, when racing began, we decided that we would set the grid by determining, having a qualifying type scenario, and the fastest car would start first. Somebody made that decision. If back in those days someone had made the other decision and said, right, the fastest car is going to start at the back, we'd not be thinking there's anything weird about that. And actually, as time has gone on and the gap between the fastest cars and the slowest cars in modern Formula One has become so great, you just get this gradual spreading of the field over the course of a Grand Prix. And we shout about these races where we have two cars fighting wheel to wheel. We're over the moon about this particular championship because two guys from two different teams are on a very rare occasion battling for a championship. That's not been something we've seen for years and years and years, and it shows you how rare it is where we're shouting about how great the championship is. And I know there are other little battles throughout the field, but it's rare over the course of a Grand Prix to see a huge amount of action. This year's been great on that front, but historically, in recent history, we haven't had it. And I'd just like to see it experimented with in the same way that we've had sprint weekends as an experiment. And, you know, if it doesn't work, we don't have to carry it on, do we? Right, last few minutes. Mandatory 2 stops for medium and hard tyres, race start on softs. Yeah, we've kind of covered that. So all 3 tyres being used. I kind of like it. I'm all for it. Reverse grids enable the best to truly shine. It's been done on ovals for years, says Tezel49. Agreed, it could absolutely work. Maybe not everywhere. There'll be certain circuits where it's just so difficult to overtake. Monaco, no point in doing a reverse grid in Monaco, is there? It just wouldn't work. But in some places, it definitely could. So somebody clarifying, Mark, he meant one sprint race weekend and then the next one with the standard qualifying. Okay, I get it. So you want to alternate the sprint weekends with standard weekends. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. If you like the sprint weekend, why not introduce it on more races over the course of a season? I think that's what's going to happen as we move forward. And it may be that deciding which racetracks we use a sprint weekend on could be key as well, because, you know, with a sprint race, which is shorter, you need a circuit that lends itself to overtaking. Otherwise, it really is a dull procession for however many laps it is. Okay, right, we're almost there. Let's see if we can get another one in. Right, either cost cap or strict regulations. Having both doesn't make sense, says Ruben H. I agree with you, Ruben, and I think we'll get to that point at some stage. At the moment, we've got very tight regulations. Many of those regulations have been put in to stop teams spending a huge amount of money. We've now got a cost cap. For me, now we're cost capped. Let's free up the regulations and let them create whatever they want. Let them decide where they want to spend their money. I think it'll be a fascinating experiment from a technical perspective in Formula One. Let the shackles off these brilliant engineers and see what they come up with, as long as they stay within that very strict budget cap. I think we'll get to that point. I think they're just figuring out the budget caps at the moment, letting the dust settle, letting it figure itself out, and then we can start releasing some of that, I'm sure. Listen, that's about it, guys. Thank you so much for joining again. I really appreciate it. Do us a favour, and on the way out, just knock that like button. It would be great if you could get those numbers up before you go. Have a wonderful week. Thank you to everybody who has sent some love around Wheeler Dealers. It's been an absolute joy for me. I'm so pleased that so many of you have enjoyed it too. I know Mike feels exactly the same. We're overwhelmed by the support that we've had off the back of it. There's plenty more to come. We are filming right through until May of next year, creating more and more TV. So that's going to be coming for a long time to come, and hopefully beyond that too. As I said, if you're around this weekend, get down to the NEC. I'll be there all weekend, just mingling amongst the crowd, on stage as well. Happy to come and say hello to any of you. And I'll see you next week after the Brazilian Grand Prix, back at the normal time of 9 p.m. on a Monday night, but I'll let you all know that beforehand. Have a great week. Enjoy the Brazilian Grand Prix, and I'll see you all very, very soon. Cheers, guys. Ta-da!